Hey guys, and welcome to the third video on India, the third and final video, where we'll be talking about the Gupta dynasty as well as a couple of aspects of Indian society. So we'll go back to our map, the same map that I've been showing you guys a couple of times throughout these series, and you see the extent of the Maurya Empire, which are all the areas shaded in brown, and then the kind of reddish-pink outline here was the extent of the Gupta Empire. So right away you can see that the Gupta Empire was significantly smaller than the Maurya Empire. They had lost almost the entire Deccan Plateau. Anything beyond the Indus River was out of their control, right? That was controlled by that Kushan Empire that we talked about at the end of the last video. But they still controlled a couple of key points. They still controlled the Ganges Plain. Through here, you see Pataliputra, right? The capital city is still there. And the Bay of Bengal trading ports that come up into the mouth of the Ganges River. So still some prime real estate that they control, but overall they were not as extensive as the Maurya Empire. Now, they were around in the Common Era. So now we are past the point of, in the Christian calendar after the birth of Christ. And now we're well into the Common Era, 320 to 647. And they ruled a good bit more decentralized government than the Maurya. Remember, especially under Chandragupta, he was big about centralizing power, about taking everything under his control and having a very strict control over his bureaucracy. And the Gupta rulers just weren't about that. It was a little more kind of loosely held together. They relied more on the loyalty of the nobles, which eventually weakened them and led them more susceptible to outside attack. The most notable one being the White Hun invasion. Huns were a group that were from up in Central Asia. We'll read more about the Huns when we get to the Roman Empire with their leader Attila. And the White Huns were a group that came down and conquered through into, the Indus River and across the Hindu Kush and the Khyber Pass and so forth, and really destabilized the last remnants of the Gupta Empire. All right, you see the map here. The kind of greenish color over here, that's the last stages of the Gupta Empire, and then the Empire of the Huns. Notice the empire's in quotes because it was not a centralized, tightly controlled empire. Most of these Central Asian peoples, such as the Mongols that we'll talk about later, they were largely nomadic and, bound together as more tribal units than anything else. But they were still fierce fighters, and they made all sorts of problems for the Gupta Empire. And as you see here, the Gupta Empire was effectively over by the year 500. So while they were still empires that were kicking around for close to another 150 years, they were not recognized as being any united empire at that point. So that would be the end of the Guptas. But the Guptas are still very, very important in Indian history because of their achievements, particularly in the sciences, medicine. Now, their medicine was all natural at this point. We're talking almost 2,000 years ago, so you don't have chemicals, you don't have artificially made stuff. It was all from natural herbs, and they were able to do some really amazing things with this. They were able to devise very early forms of inoculations, right? Inoculations, think of as vaccines, in order to ward off future illnesses. They were able to come up with anesthesia. They were able to perform surgeries, and take out body parts and open the body cavity and so forth. They were even able to come up with a somewhat more primitive, but still a basic form of plastic surgery, right? Because this is obviously all natural. Ugh, get them out of there. So medicine, a lot of cool things that the Guptas were doing with medicine. Astronomy, we know, looking up at the stars. And well, about 1,000 years before Columbus sailed across the ocean blue, they had mathematically figured out that the Earth was round. Sorry, Kyrie, but the Earth is round. There was no way of proving it, but because they figured just based on viewing how the stars in the heavens went across the sky, they said it just makes sense that we have a round planet that rotates on an axis, and that made sense that it also revolves around a sun. So Indian astronomers came up with a heliocentric model hundreds of years before it was accepted in Europe. With math, a couple of really, really important things going on with math. They invented the decimal system. Now, decimals, it kind of breaks it down by tens and hundreds and thousands and so forth. And then if you go on the other side of a decimal point, you got tenths and thousandths and so forth. What makes all this possible is this right here, a 0. Roman numerals, you can't do this type of stuff. Right? You might get like 3 is I, but then you start getting into IV, and then V and VI and so forth. There's no concept of 0 in the Roman numeric system. This allows them to break everything down into tens. It breaks it down into ones and zeros ultimately. Now, obviously, it's not all ones and zeros. You got 7, you got 2, you got 3. They also invented a numeric system, Indian numerals, that our current numeral system is based on. We refer to them as Arab numerals because by the time they made these numerals made their way into Europe, that was learned. Europeans learned them from Arab traders, and Arab traders just took credit for it. And by the time it became well established as Arab numerals, nobody felt like changing it. But technically, these are Indian numerals. Arab traders learned this from India, and you notice 0 right here. That's the big one. 2, 3. Gets a little weird at that point. 4 is an 8. I don't know what the hell you call this. It's 6. Right? But notice this when you start getting into your tens. 10, this is for 1 and a 0. 11, 1 and 1. 12, 1 and 2, and so forth. The concepts are the same that we use. They change up the symbols for some of their numerals, but we use the exact same concept that was developed 1,500 to 2,000 years ago by Indian mathematicians. Another thing that we have to thank for them, so these math geeks can celebrate March 14th, pi. In order to determine the circumference. Remember, it goes back to the study of a round Earth. This 3.14, and able to kind of get it pretty accurately, was developed. Now, trade. You see, first talk about some overland trade routes. Two things that I want to mention with this. One is, as you see, trade routes that came through Asia into the Middle East, right? We got the Silk Road being a big one up here. What starts to develop along these routes are towns. Towns and cities, they become centers of trade. And many of them begin to specialize. You notice like in this region, you've got cotton. In this region, you have rice. You got gold down here. You start to see what's called trade regional specialization. Okay, again, trade regional specialization. Different regions specialize in different goods to sell. And it can be mutually beneficial for all of these different regions. It can bring prosperity to numerous regions because now you've got interregional trade. These guys are trading here and so forth. So the expansion of towns and also regional trade specialization. Let me get rid of this because then I want to also show you maritime trade. Notice where India is situated, right smack in the middle of the Middle East and East Africa and the Far East with China and Southeast Asia. You want to get from Alexandria to Malacca, all right, all the way out to Guangzhou and so forth, chances are you're going to have to stop in Calicut. You're going to have to stop in Cambay or so forth, somewhere in the Bay of Bengal. So this was a lot of money that was coming in because of their geographic location. Also important to remember the dependence on the monsoons. Monsoons are seasonal winds, right? From April to September, they come more from the south. That's good for agriculture. The other way, November to February, more drier winds, maybe not as good for agriculture, but both ways had to be taken into account for merchants as they were doing business on the Indian Ocean. So this Indian Ocean basin trade was dominated by India because of its central location in it. Okay, one last thing to go over with this one, a couple things about Indian society. Now, we've mentioned this already, but Indian society, very, very patriarchal. Okay, going back to, the law of Manu, kind of their earliest teachings, talking about how women cannot be trusted. And it was very, very much dominated by males. And this could be seen in the epic poems going back to the Vedic ages. In the Ramayana, here you have the hero, the Prince Rama, and his wife Sita. And she was really representative of, female purity and female devotion. Rama gets outcast from the kingdom, and she she follows him without question, and then afterwards, even after she's proven herself and following him to exile and so forth, and they've spent time, many, many years alone together, he still required a kind of a trial by fire, so to speak, a fire trial, literally, in order for her to prove her devotion to him. So it was meant to reinforce the values that the woman goes wherever the man does. The man makes all the decisions, the husband calls the shots for it, and the woman just goes along, smiles, and does whatever her husband tells her to do. Another thing with marriage that you saw an awful lot during this time period, and unfortunately you still see it today, hence a photograph that I was able to find, but child brides. It's frowned upon in many areas in India, but as you see, it still exists. Girls as young as 12 and 13 years of age that are married off in arranged marriages, sometimes to males closer in age, but other times maybe adults well into their 20s and 30s. It really didn't matter. But again, it didn't matter about her her emotional development or anything like that. It was just a matter, could she bear children? That was the only thing that mattered. Now, the caste system, right? We've talked about this a bunch. Here are your 4 basic castes that were created back during the early Aryan days: priests, warriors, middle class, merchants, craftsmen, and then peasants down at the bottom. Well, the caste system develops and becomes more complex as the centuries go on. And the main reason for that is trade. Trade has led these guys in particular to increase their wealth. Even some of these guys to a lesser extent. Right, the Shudras, but definitely the Vaishyas, your merchants and craftsmen. They're becoming very wealthy, and many of them, in terms of monetary value, are now starting to surpass Kshatriyas and even Brahmins. Right, but remember, the caste system was not just about wealth. It was about spiritual purity. It was about kind of duty and responsibility as well. So they still had an obligation to fill their role, but the Vaishya role was starting to change. Now, it wasn't just to serve the other two. Right? Brahmins as priests and Kshatriyas as warriors, they had their very specific roles. Vaishyas and Shudras, they were meant to be subservient to them. But now with these Vaishyas, it's starting to change a bit, and even with some of the Shudras as well. As I said, that's mostly because of the trade and the changes that were being made to the Indian economy. So what you see is trade leads to these things called jati. These are subcastes, right? They're subcategories within them. And you start to see some jumping back and forth now for the first time. Not much, right? They still have very strict rules put in place because of Hindu beliefs and things like dharma and karma and, samsara. That still applies. I'm not saying that the system is totally thrown out of whack, but it's not quite so clear cut of you are A, B, C, or D anymore. Trade has really added a lot of complexity to the caste system. Okay, so that wraps it up, what we'll be talking about on Indian society. And for the next one, we will be discussing the next chapter, and that has to do with Greece and the Mediterranean world.